Hi, everyone. I'm Samuel Singler. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Criminology at the University of Oxford. Apologies. Together with Professor Marcia van der Vood, I'm convening this year's Border Criminology's seminar series. This year, our focus has been on bringing in new disciplinary and theoretical perspectives to the Border Criminology's network. And today's seminar will be our last this year, but we are set to continue the series in the new year. So please keep an eye out for further information on that in due course. Today, we're hosting Professor William Walters from Carleton University in Ottawa, who will be talking on the somewhat under-researched topic of deportation practices. As he has highlighted in his recent work, while critical research is focused on systems of immigration control, immigration detention, and post-deportation experiences, the actual practices of deportation remain somewhat overlooked. Professor Walters has published widely in the fields of political sociology, political geography, citizenship studies, and security and insecurity from a broadly Foucauldian perspective. His work on globalization and border controls as governmentality has been hugely influential in political theory and international political sociology, and his account of the role of citizenship in the international management of populations is directly relevant for most of us working in the border criminology's field. And building on his previous research, his upcoming publications include the monograph, State Secrecy and Security, Refiguring the Covert Imaginary by Routledge, and the co-edited book, Biopolitics, Borders, Migration, and the Power of Locomotion by Duke University Press. And directly relevant to the topic at hand today, Professor Walters is currently the principal investigator on the Air Deportation Project, which is a multi-country inquiry into the aerial geographies of forced removal and expulsion in and from Europe. And to make things even more exciting, following Professor Walters' presentation, we'll hear a response from Professor Mary Bosworth, who is director of the Center for Criminology at the University of Oxford and director of the Border Criminology's network. Her work on the criminology of mobility is prolific, and many of us will have already been familiar with her monograph, Inside Immigration Detention by OUP, and more recent reports on the quality of life in detention together with Dr. Alice Gerlach. Directly addressing the aforementioned scarcity of scholarship on deportation practices, Professor Bosworth is currently conducting a research project into migrant escorting and forced removal in the UK. This project includes unprecedented first-hand access into the everyday work of the detention custody officers who escort migrants between immigration removal centers, immigration tribunals, prisons, and airports, as well as the practicalities of deportation on both commercial and charter flights. So what we have today will be a highly engaging presentation by Professor Walters and then a discussion between two very prolific scholars of border controls and deportation. And following this presentation and discussion, we'll have an open Q&A. So if you have any questions at that stage, please just indicate that in the chat function or by raising your hand on Zoom, and I can then pass it over to you and moderate the Q&A. But I don't want to keep you any longer from today's main event. So William, feel free to take over and share your screen.
Okay. Is that working?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction, Samuel. It's a real honor to be taking part here, and I'd like to thank Samuel and Professor Bosworth for this invitation and this opportunity both to present and more than that, to have a conversation, to have a dialogue after the presentation. I'll just say that I've got a cat that circles around at my feet and occasionally scratches me while I'm presenting, and I realized yesterday when I was teaching, I had to tell the students I'm grimacing not because of anything you just said, it's because of the cat. And I can't lock it out the door. I can't lock it out the room because it will just make a noise, so I'm just kind of living with the cat, tolerating it. I apologize that I've changed the title a little bit, but it remains very much along the lines that I'd originally advertised. So the title is now The Deportation Plane, 3 Arguments on an Emergent Form of Expulsion. So early yesterday, The Home Office deported 13 men to Jamaica on what the Guardian describes as, rightly, a controversial charter flight. Controversial for many reasons, including the fact that it comes in the midst, in the wake of the Windrush scandal and the racist logic of hostile environment. It comes in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. Controversial because some of the men originally earmarked for removal had come to the UK as children and were long settled with families and children. And controversial because some initially targeted may have been victims of trafficking. And as many as 50 people were originally to be removed, but last-minute reprieves saw the number reduced to 13 who boarded the plane, I believe. Now, one feature of this controversy is the way the plane itself became a mediator in the complex struggles that have unfolded. The plane circulated as a meme, as a metonym for the deportation, and an expressive medium for all sides of the issue, both pro and anti-deportation, xenophobic and anti-racist. But it also figured as a material stake. And in the week leading up to the flight, the identity of the airline was kept secret and featured as a kind of mystery. It was a sort of absent presence. Rumours swirled online as to which airline had been hired. One of the many defense campaigns was a letter signed by 82 prominent Black public figures urging airlines not to accept the contract, not to follow the services. So in this controversy, the plane was both a signifier and a material system of transport and commerce to be targeted with negative publicity. When in the hours before the flight, the identity of the plane seemed to emerge on social media, it revealed one more cruel irony. The charter was probably provided by a Spanish airline called, of all things, Privilege Style. And when I followed some online links, what came up was a short clip of the Real Madrid football team disembarking from a privileged plane. So I think it's hard to imagine a starker juxtaposition of the privileged and the expelled than that. Now, my impression is that a gap exists between the way we as publics, activists and citizens follow and perhaps participate in a controversy like the Jamaica 50 and the way that many scholars approach and study deportation. And I offer this presentation as a sort of small contribution towards bridging that gap. But what is the gap? With the Jamaica 50, as with many other mobilizations and anti-deportation protests, aircraft, airlines, air routes, and much else feature very prominently, both as symbols and material systems. But in a great deal of the deportation scholarship, aviation is really quite marginal, and it's kind of there as a backdrop and maybe just a sort of incidental feature. In a very recent article called The Final Act, Deportation by ICE Air, Deborah Weissman and her colleagues in the US argue that in a great deal of the literature, and they're talking mostly, I think, about the US literature, deportation is studied as a legal concept. But they insist that in addition, it should be studied as a physical act. And I quote them: "The physical removal of people from the United States requires a complex system comprised of aviation networks and their various components, airports and airplanes, hangars and flight crew, and an array of physical restraints to intimidate, punish or subdue deportees." And they argue it's necessary to examine this infrastructure, to map it, both because it is largely hidden and because of the often egregious violations of rights which its existence and its opacity facilitates. And they speak of it being hidden in plain sight, and they use plain in both senses there, you know, both spellings of plain. So I'm largely sympathetic to Weissman and Issel's argument, and I've made a similar one in writing about aviation as infrastructure. But I think it's an argument that needs to be qualified a little when we turn to European cases. For one thing, we can point to the growth of a literature that trains an ethnographic and sociological eye on detention, uncovering not just its legal features and tensions, but understanding it as a very real physical, emotional, and social phenomenon. And Mary Bosworth's work has really led the way there. And detention is, of course, an integral part of this deportation infrastructure. If you need costly seats to be filled and planes to leave on schedule, you need ways to ensure the reluctant and unfortunate travellers are there on time. And detention serves multiple functions, and one of them is precisely that of gathering, holding, funneling, sequencing. And I think it's no coincidence that the map of European detention centres maps partly onto the geography of international airports. There's a correspondence there. But I would point out that scholarship on European migration has explored aviation in other ways and sometimes more directly. So there's the work of Chura Makaremi and Pauline Maé, who've looked at waiting zones in French airports. Gilles Alpez has looked at the fate of deportees when they arrive in airports in Cameroon. My collaborator, Clara Le Cadet, has done work on the anthropology of civic associations and political groups of ex-deportees in Sierra Leone and Mali, including the reception work that they put on in airports for the newly deported. And in the UK, Liz Ficati has done pioneering work on charter flights and accelerated removals. And Corporate Watch, with whom I've collaborated in this work, have trained an eye on charter flights as well. State Watch has dug into Frontex and the Europeanization of the charter flight. So there's been some important work done in different directions and different disciplines, both sort of academic and investigative journalism. But I think despite these important interventions, there's much we don't know or have yet to adequately theorize when it comes to the role which aviation plays in deportation, this aviation deportation nexus. How does it undergird practices and processes of moving people who are mostly racialized and othered? So my talk today draws on a 5-year project dedicated to the study of and conceptualization of what I call air deportation. It has the UK and France and Mali as its cases. And I'm doing this work, as I mentioned, in collaboration with Clara Le Cadet at EHESS in Paris and Cédric Parizeau at Aix-Marseille. And our starting proposition, if you will, is that in the big deporting countries like France and Germany, and probably in the UK too, well over 90% of deportations proceed via the air. Now, when it comes to migrant journeys and what's called irregular border crossing, we have a debate and a concept of boat migration. You can see it's sort of visualized and presented in many of these images, in reports and in maps. So there's a sort of asymmetry here. Why is there no air deportation in the literature? Why is the air not granted a similar degree of conceptual and empirical attention in studies of deportation? And if I can make a brief plug, as in proceeding, we are working on a special issue of the Radical Geography journal Anti-Atlas. We have a call for papers out, so if anybody online today has something that they would like to propose, then please do send us a proposal. There is the web address. I think we're taking proposals until December the 15th. So my aim in this talk today is to advance this debate about aviation and deportation. And I'm going to do this not by talking about air deportation in general, but rather through a focus on the field of operations to which the Jamaica 50 belongs. So I'm going to look at deportation charters in the UK, or as I will call this field, the deportation plane. Now, it's true that only a distinct minority of deportees leave on these charter flights. The majority travel on regular scheduled flights alongside tourists and business people. And I show this image. It's a sort of early campaign targeting airlines, targeting Lufthansa in this case. And the image was important for me. It really got me thinking about airlines and deportation back in about 2001, when I first became interested in the topic and found, why is there no literature really discussing airlines? There's a sort of activist literature, a bit of a journalistic literature, but very little sort of scholarship on this phenomenon. So most people leave on scheduled flights, but nevertheless, the shadow that the charter flight, the deportation plane as I'll call it, the shadow it casts on the unsettled landscape of expulsion is such that it merits attention, I think, in its own right. So in what follows, I'll set out 3 arguments about the deportation plane. And in making these arguments, I'll be drawing mostly on the reports of Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, who inspect a sample of these flights in terms of norms and standards of human rights. So my 3 arguments are, first, that concepts matter. Second, that the deportation plane has a complex and paradoxical visibility. And third, that inspection reports offer us an archive to better understand this emergent form. But before I get to those, just a few facts to put the object in perspective. And here I draw especially on Corporate Watch, who in several reports have generated an overview of the UK's deportation plane system. So not a lot of official data is published routinely on these flights, and it's been gathered in a piecemeal way. It's kind of like what Gustafson calls polymorphous engagement, and that includes freedom of information requests. So Corporate Watch reports that in 2017, there were a total of 42 flights carrying just under 1,700 people, 94% of them male. The main destinations were Albania with 15 flights, Pakistan with 11 flights, Nigeria and Ghana with 7 flights, and just 1 flight to Jamaica. Now, while the Home Office and many media sources, and as we saw a lot of online talk, equate and justify these flights with the argument that they're removing dangerous criminals, in 2017 and 2016, less than a third of the total removed this way fitted the description of criminal offender. So the first of my 3 arguments or points, that concepts matter, and I'm calling for a shift from thinking in terms of return flights to the deportation plane. So in policy discourse, in the inspection reports themselves, and in a lot of media coverage, we see terms like return flight, repatriation flight, deportation charter flight, removal flight. I think these terms are wholly inadequate and quite misleading. As my colleague Clara Lucadé points out, terms like return and repatriation can be euphemisms which gloss over the violence of the deportation plane and the deportation process, while naturalizing expulsion by associating it with a going back. But what kind of return, what kind of homecoming awaits people who have not lived in Jamaica since they were small? What kind of return is it when Britain is already your home and you're being torn away from your family, your work, your community? So those terms are inadequate. Deportation charter flight is also inadequate. True, it has the benefit of referencing the way in which these planes are contracted by immigration authorities from private airlines. But in English usage, at least, charter flights are associated often with holidaymakers. So these people might be cramped in the cabin, they might be complaining about the leg space, but for the most part, they're happy and possibly drunk as they head off to a sunny vacation. So I think charter has the wrong connotation too. Even the term flight is a bit thin, a bit anemic. It foregrounds the actual journey, the event, but rather skates over the existence of a system undergirding it. So I use the term deportation plane and sometimes deportation plane system because I don't want to reify or fetishize the plane and neglect the wider system that puts it in the air or on the ground. And I use this to refer to these flights where people are deported in groups that range anywhere from 10 to 60 people typically, on planes where they're accompanied and significantly outnumbered by escorts and other authorities. And I have an image here. It doesn't concern UK deportation planes so much as Frontex organised joint return operations that involve multiple countries. It's an image that appeared in the online Die Zeit in 2015. And I think it captures something of the systematicity of materiality. You know, don't know if you can see it clearly, but the deportees are symbolized in yellow and staff in blue. So you get a sort of mapping, a kind of metric of force and how it varies across the different planes and destinations. And this represents the total of joint return operations that were run in 2014. And I think also the fact that the planes fill the frame suggests a kind of concertation of force, a kind of European air force of expulsion, as it were. So calling this the deportation plane immediately inscribes it in a different landscape, one that together with Charles Heller and Lorenzo Pizzani, I called via politics. We've just, as Samuel mentioned, we've just completed an edited book on this subject. And I think that thinking in terms of the deportation plane allows us to situate it alongside other vehicles of migration, transportation, and coercion and domination that manifest a not dissimilar combination of material and symbolic power. The refugee boat, the slave ship, the deportation train, the rendition plane. Now, I should stress from the outset that I'm not suggesting that the deportation plane is like a slave ship, even if that allusion has been made visually in certain reports. And I'm not suggesting that the deportations that we're witnessing in Europe today resemble the lethal and dehumanizing systems of trains that underpinned the Holocaust. Nor am I saying that removing people on these planes is because of its covert nature or the element of surprise and disorientation that is sometimes involved, for example, when you wake people up and remove them in the middle of the night. I'm not saying it's comparable to the extraordinary rendition of people accused of terrorism. Although I would note that some digital journalists, such as these who worked with BuzzFeed News, have used precisely the same techniques to make rendition flights and deportation flights visible, in this case, by following the call signals of planes, in this case, small Beechcraft planes, the French border police, to carry out deportations in 2016 and 2017. And this is a mapping then of those flights. And it's one of the very rare occasions on which I found a map of deportation routes. So we see, you know, if you type in migration routes into Google, you'll get hundreds of maps of routes across the Mediterranean, for example, through the Balkans. So the migration route has this prominent place in the public and in the expert and the scholarly spheres. But deportation routes, if you type deportation route into Google, you will get you will get maps from the Holocaust, you will get maps of the deportation of the Akkadians or the Armenian genocides. But you'll find very little of a sort of visual presence of the deportation route. So in other work, I've been interested in what is a deportation route. Anyway, all of that's to say that I'm very wary of a kind of radical hyperbole or rhetorical excess that can sometimes be fashionable in academia. And I think that happened when some scholars enthusiastically took up Agamben's figure of the camp, a diagram he derived from the Nazi death camps. So I'm not doing that, what I think the reference to the deportation plane does accomplish, and what we gain by situating it in this wider field, is that we identify it as a distinctive socio-material form. And that's kind of something I really want to stress. So I think the moment that we can see the deportation plane as a form and not just a flight, then we can begin to ask the kind of questions that have been asked of these other forms, using that kind of scholarship as a guideline. What is the genesis of the deportation plane? What struggles forged this form and are changing it? How can its history be reconstructed? And what can we learn from that history? And just to give you a little example that's come out of work, a chapter in the Biopolitics book that I've co-written with Clara. It's an image, you know, it shows you how this history can be excavated in unexpected places. And this image comes from the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. It shows a Jewish refugee, Oscar Goldberg, being carried away from Croydon Aerodrome in March 1939. Now, the day before, a whole stream of planes had arrived in Croydon, bringing people, Jewish refugees mostly, who were fleeing the advance of Nazism from Central Europe. And in this case, Goldberg, along with his party, or the police are trying to carry them back onto the plane that brought them. And I ask, you know, was this the first attempt at air deportation from Britain? I don't know. But whether it is or not, it gathers in microcosm key themes that remain pertinent to this day. Struggle, the refusal of the pilot to fly, less out of sympathy and more from fear for the safety of the plane. The determination of the authorities to try again the next day, because this air deportation failed. The difference which the photograph made once it appeared in the Daily Mail, and we might say how things have changed, which led a campaign to win temporary residence for the refugees. Or the fact that these kinds of campaigns invariably save some, perhaps the seemingly more worthy, and not others, so that there's a kind of deportation triage. I think the last thing to say about this image, the fact that Goldberg is struggling in this photograph is significant. It reminds us of something to bear in mind as we proceed, or certainly as I proceed today. You know, deportation is a political practice that is shot through with struggle. And if this talk, I present the deportation plane as an innovation in modes of expulsion, this isn't because a cunning deportation state exists somewhere and periodically dreams up ever more devious ways of doing things. It's because the struggles of those facing removal and their allies and all sorts of actors have rendered other ways of proceeding unworkable, unviable, unwieldy, unacceptable, expensive, inefficient. After all, if people meekly accepted their fate, if all people meekly accepted their fate, or if the hostile environment and the voluntary return schemes worked perfectly as sticks and carrots, such that people all practiced what Kay Sue Park has called in an excellent paper, self-deportation, there would be no deportation plane, or not in its present form. But they don't. So struggle instead creates the space, the impasse, the blockage at which this form emerges. And struggle has forged it on every scale, from the types of violence that are ratified, such as waist restraint belts, and those that are prohibited or taboo, such as the sort of widespread use of drugs and sedatives, to the forms of advance notification that people are given or not given about when and where they're going to be removed, to the geography of the airports that are used, to the geography of the routes themselves in the countries which have refused deportation planes, such as Sri Lanka. All of these elements have a history shaped by struggles. So the deportation plane is made by all these forces and encounters. And I'm only able to mention a few in passing, but I think it's important to make that point from the outset. So I move to my second argument. The deportation plane has a complex and paradoxical visibility. So before the 2000s, and looking across Europe, the deportation plane appeared as an ad hoc, infrequent event. From the 2000s onwards, it begins to become a routine, normal, systematized operation. Why this timing? Well, there are many factors, but one seems to be the problem of disruption, which deporting people on regular scheduled flights was giving rise to, and we can sort of express this visually with images like this one, the Swedish student Ellen Ersson, who disrupted and stopped a deportation on a plane from Gothenburg and live streamed it on Facebook. Or this one, a recent hacktivist campaign of postering mounted by lesbians and gays support the migrants on the London Underground. And what these sort of images capture or express are the possibility of activists, passengers and deportees frustrating a removal by disturbing the delicate ecology of aviation protocols, entangling captains, crews and other passengers in matters that they would rather not be a party to. So the deportation plane holds out an alternative to this scenario because it moves the deportee out of sight of a travelling public. On a deportation plane, there are no regular passengers, only detainees, the flight crew, and the phalanx of escorts and officials that greatly outnumber them usually. So detention centres, buses, planes and other procedures create what Hasselberg and Drockbaum have dubbed deportation corridors, or as I put it elsewhere in work with my colleague Huub Dijsselbloem, they create envelopes. Envelopes because, a bit like a postal envelope, they facilitate mobility by material operations of surrounding, sealing and enclosing. And it's this operation of enclosure which increases the risk of mistreatment and abuse, making the deportation plane an intimidating prospect. But in other ways, the deportation plane is not invisible at all. Politically, it's very visible. But this visibility is of a sporadic, episodic, and sometimes spectacular nature, as we saw with the Jamaica 50, or as with the Stansted 15, the collective actor that you all will know, I'm sure, stopped a deportation plane from leaving that airport in 2017. So I think this play of visibilities and invisibilities, this fact that in some ways the deportation plane has a very prominent political visibility well out of proportion to the numbers that it actually carries, is a question that deserves a lot more attention. So I'm moving to my third argument, my third and final argument, which is that inspection reports give us an archive for studying the deportation plane. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons routinely inspect a sample of deportation flights, just as they inspect detention centres and other places of confinement within the immigration system. And this work contributes to the UK's response to its international obligations under OBCAT. OBCAT requires that all places of detention, whether fixed or in this case mobile, undergo regular visits from independent bodies. And these bodies are known as national preventive mechanisms. And as Hinpal Singh Bui notes, while the inspection of prisons has a very long history in the UK, the fact that HMIP should play a role in the inspection of immigration detention is a more recent development, properly established only in about 2004, and that the extension of this human rights monitoring gaze to the conditions and procedures affecting irregular migrants in airports and on planes is an even more recent phenomenon. So I think HMIP's first inspection of an overseas escorted removal took place in 2011, a flight to Jamaica. And a similar pattern we see when we look across the EU. The growing sort of institutionalization of inspection and reporting of deportation flights, but it's done by different kinds of bodies, some with more independence, others with less. So my inspiration in taking inspection reports seriously comes from none other than Karl Marx and his use of the factory reports. And you'll need no reminding that the inquiries of the Victorian Inspectorate, which probed the emerging world of factory capitalism in the 1830s, 1840s, was an important source of knowledge for Marx, especially his theorization of struggles over the working day in Volume 1 of Capital. And I think that if the emergent factory system in cities like Manchester was a relatively closed world, closed by the moral and legal appeals that owners made to rights of privacy and property, then the factory reports represented a line by which this world could be opened up a little and reformed. And I think something similar can be said of the inspection reports into detention and deportation planes. Now, these reports have at least three strengths, which I briefly summarize. First, they're extremely detailed. Certainly, they draw public attention to some really big issues, most notably instances of mistreatment and violence, which can be a feature of the deportation plane. For example, the inspectors often note cases where waist restraint belts are overused, especially on so-called Dublin return flights. But the inspectors also capture little details that don't make the headlines. For example, in an early report on a flight to Jamaica in 2011, the inspectors identify, almost in passing, a kind of supervisory division of labor between the small G4S security team and the rest of the escorts. They say, quote, "At the key moment of boarding," unquote, the detainees were, quote, "escorted by members of the security team in order to avoid undermining the rapport built up by the staff who had escorted them thus far, and would do so during the flight." So I think this tells us that rapport is not something spontaneous or natural necessarily, but itself a practice that has to be cultivated and to some extent planned for. This is not to dispute the fact that some escorts might feel genuine empathy for their charges, and I think Mary's work has been excellent in sort of showing the various ways in which escorts and people working in detention centres feel about their work and express their relationships to the people that they're in charge of. So it's not to call into question different motives or attitudes, but it is to point out that these so-called soft practices are as much a part of the production of deportation as the exercise of force. And I think that's especially true when one's talking about air deportation, where, you know, the question of how you manage people in the very cramped confines of an aircraft cabin at thousands of feet in the air, the calm really is important. The second thing to say is that reporting is a serial practice, and this is important. The reports generate an archive which allows us to follow the deportation plane, albeit fragmentarily, over time and space. It allows us to detect little shifts, innovations and mutations in the deportation plane system. So, for example, a 2017 flight to Jamaica, they note that there was a new system of transit. Instead of taking the detainees through the airport terminal and doing the security procedure there, they were driven straight to the plane. The inspectors say that this spares the deportees the often demeaning process of being marched through airport security. But I can't help wonder whether this is also another kind of tightening of the envelope, another measure to insulate the removal process from any outside witnessing or interruption. So it's another aspect of what Alison Mounts might call the changing microgeographies of detention and deportation. Finally, I think it's worth pointing that these reports have a certain credibility and impact in the wider public sphere. And this, I think, owes much to the fact that HMIP is not regarded as a mere puppet of the government of the day, but, as Hinpal Singh Bhui has noted, as an inspection team leader himself, it's a voice that strives to be independent and doesn't hesitate in criticising, sometimes forcefully, the conditions that they encounter. So I think scholars sometimes attribute a bit too much coherence and unity to the deportation state. It's a point that's been made by Barak Kalia, among others. But I think it's precisely because the state isn't unified, but, as Marx would have noted, riven with conflicts, blocks and counterpowers, that we can get out of it inspection reports and in monitoring practices that can be a useful, valuable resource for scholarship. None of this means that we should treat these reports as neutral accounts. They need a kind of critical reading. And I follow Ben Gidley, who's written an excellent chapter on Marx's way of reading the factory reports that I think provides a useful guide for thinking about how one does a critical reading of the reports and what it means to treat them as an archive. So I've got about 4 minutes, so I'm going to move to my conclusion. In this talk, I've identified the deportation plane as a distinctive socio-material form and argued that it represents a relatively new mode of expulsion. And I've indicated a few percepts, concepts, and guidelines and archives that might be used to deepen our understanding of this form. And let me finish then with 2 points. I think firstly that this analogy with the factory system could be pushed further. So, for example, in a report on a detention centre in 2011, inspectors noted for the first time the use of the practice of reserves, that is, taking people to the plane in case a seat becomes available due to a last-minute legal injunction, and then taking them back to the detention centre if it didn't. And the inspector condemns this as an inhuman practice that should cease due to the additional distress that it creates for the detainees. And these criticisms gain public and parliamentary attention. Yet the immigration authorities have persisted with the policy. And this story made me think of Marx and the factory system, and more generally, how he theorizes the relationship of capitalism as an economic system to law and politics. He sees capitalism as restless, dynamic, constantly pushing, trying out new practices, forging new relations, exploring workarounds when faced with obstacles. It has a tendency to race ahead of law and morality, pushing at their boundaries, forcing them to play catch up. And I think the practice of reserves merits that description, as does, very recently reading a very recent State Watch report called Deportation Union, which again is looking at Frontex's role in organizing these flights. And it talks about a relatively new practice called, National Collection Operations, I think, NCOs. And this is a scheme where countries like Ukraine and Albania send their own planes to some EU member countries to pick up expellees that the EU member wants to be rid of. It's a bit like, when you have a birthday party, and when the party's over, you call the parent to pick up their child from your home. And what State Watch highlights is that Frontex has actually been financing these operations since 2014, excuse me, at least 2 years before it had a legal mandate to do so. So I think the bigger point here is that while we should avoid imputing too much overall coherence or singular logic to systems of deportation, we should recognize it as something dynamic, something which often operates at limits. The very final thing I want to say, it's a broader point, which is I think we need a different view of civil aviation. So it's not that we have a benign view of civil aviation. We criticize it on environmental grounds, safety grounds, ethical grounds, commercial grounds. But I think in migration studies, we lack an appreciation of civil aviation in terms of geopolitical power, or as I put it in a blog post for Border Criminologies, we don't see it as air power, but I think we should. You know, we only equate air power with military force and with fighter planes and bombers and so on. And we have a vast sort of critical literature on air power in that sense. But what about civil aviation as air power too? So I leave you with this final image. It was a poster that came back into circulation, back to life, if you like, a few years ago when British Airways, and Imperial Airways, its original predecessor, British Airways celebrated its centenary. So it was very happy about what a great, great 100 years it's been. And so I think it's a very rich poster, and I think that sometimes posters can do thinking work for us. You know, they work like what Deleuze and Guattari call percepts, which often precede the crafting of concepts. So we can clearly see the sort of, there's nothing hidden about it, that this is an imperial venture. And so we can think, and there is a literature we can use here to think about how, empire in the 1930s, when this poster appeared, was kind of being dreamt of and reinvented as an empire of the skies. And Chandra Bimal has written a really nice book on that topic. We can ask, what kind of dreams were invested in it? And how might air deportation, when we study it today, how will it appear differently if we approach it with these kinds of images in mind as well? That's it. Thank you.